Welcome back, Liberty Eagles. We are on ukulele lesson number 2. You should be sitting behind the box with your number on it. Remember, don't open the box yet. Don't play until it's time to play, and always treat the ukulele with respect, or else we will give you a paper ukulele to practice with. Last class we learned the ukulele is a member of the brass family of instruments and comes from the state of Alabama. The ukulele has lots of important parts, including the abdomen, the thorax, the feet, the silent hole, the wings, the pistachios, the drawbridge, and the goblets. And you hold the ukulele using your right leg on the neck and your left ear strumming the strings. Okay, so none of that was right. Take a minute to talk to your partner and see if you can fix all of those words that are in red. See if you can get all of those right. So much better. It's a member of the string family, comes from Hawaii. It has a head, neck, body, strings, sound hole, tuning pegs, a nut, a bridge, and frets. You play with your left hand on the neck and your right hand strumming the strings. We also learned a few tricks to remember the letter names of the strings. The string that's closest to your nose is D, and the string that's closest to your toes is E. All of the strings in order from your nose to your toes is D, G, B, E. And we had a couple silly sentences to help us remember. Here they are.
Dog's got big ears. Eric gets blue eggs.
Today it's going to be really important that you remember the order goes D, G, B, E, because we're going to practice playing the strings individually. Okay guys, I'm going to teach you how to play strings individually on the ukulele. What I want you to do first is kind of super glue either your pinky or your pinky and your ring finger down below the sound hole, and that way you'll have a good idea of where your thumb is all the time. Then you're going to use your thumb to individually pluck each string. Remember, the string closest to your nose is D, then it goes G, then B, and E is the string that is closest to your toes. D, G, B, E. Go ahead and try that. Alright guys, it's time to practice it all together. Have one person hold the ukulele and echo me. D, 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 D. D, 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 D. G, 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 G. G, 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 G. B, 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 B. B, 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 B. E, 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 E. E, 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 E. E, E, G, G. E, E, G, G. G, G, B, B. G, G, B, B. B, B, E, E. B, B, E, E. D, G, B, E. D, G, B, E. E, B, G, D. E, B, G, D. E, G, E, G. E, G, E, G. Good job, you guys. Pass your ukulele to your partner if you have one. If you don't, then you get to do that again. Here we go. D, 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 D. D, 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 D. G, 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 G. G, 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 G. B, 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 B. B, 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 B. E, 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 E. E, 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 E. E, E, G, G. E, E, G, G. G, G, B, B. G, G, B, B. B, B, E, E. B, B, E, E. D, G, B, E. D, G, B, E. E, B, G, D. E, B, G, D. E, G, E, G. E, G, E, G. Alright, pass them back to the original person that was playing for round 2. Here we go. E, B, E, B. E, B, E, B. G, D, G, D. G, D, G, D. E, D, G, B. That one's tricky. Try it again. E, D, G, B. D, D, G, B, B, E. D, D, G, B, B, E. D, 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 E, E, E. D, 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 E, E, E. D, 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 G. D, 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 G. G, 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 B. G, 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 B. B, 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 E. B, 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 E. E, 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 E. E, 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 E. That round was pretty hard. Let's see if the second group of people can do it better. Pass your ukuleles, guys. Here we go. E, B, E, B. E, B, E, B. G, D, G, D. G, D, G, D. E, D, G, B. That one's tricky. Try it again. E, D, G, B. D, D, G, B, B, E. D, D, G, B, B, E. D, 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 E, E, E. D, 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 E, E, E. D, 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 G. D, 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 G. G, 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 B. G, 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 B. B, 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 E. B, 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 E. E, 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 E. Ukulele's back into the box. I'm going to give up Blue Eagles to the first two people that have their ukulele back in the box.
Some. Today I don't feel like doing anything. I just wanna lay in my bed. Don't feel like picking up my phone to leave a message at the tone. Today I swear I'm not doing anything.
Although we're apart of my heart, but tonight you belong to me. Way down by the street, how sweet it would seem once more just to dream in the moonlight.
My honey, I
By the dawn that you will be gone.
What's that sound?
Airplane. But tonight you belong to me.
Just a little old me.
What did all those performances have in common? Take a second to read all of the answers and then raise your hand when you think you know what it is. That's right, all of the performances used chords. Here's how you play chords. You're going to keep your fingers curved with the tip of your finger pressing the string. You put your fingers slightly to the left of the fret, not on top of the fret, and you strum all the strings at once if you want to play a chord, and you can play an arpeggio if you play the strings individually.